I got my order delivery this morning from Grizzly, the tools and stuff that I ordered. Alaska Marine Lines brought a liftgate truck by, and we stopped at the bottom of the hill and it was really icy, and got the bobcat out and picked everything up and brought them up the hill. Had to go dig the forks out of the snowbank yesterday for the bobcat and got it up here. So there's the tools. There's a 12-inch 4003G gunsmith lathe. There on the far end is the box with the stands. And then we've got an 18-inch open-end drum sander and a 12-inch, little 12-inch planer, a little benchtop planer, and a metal cutting bandsaw, and a few other odds and ends there. Some a hanging dust collector and an air filter and some hoses and stuff for those. Everything looks like it came in pretty good shape. The stands for the 12-inch lathe, they tightened those strappings down so tight on it that it cut into the crate, the carton, and it dented into the internal carton. So I'll have to look inside there to see if it damaged the stands any at all. But everything else came through externally, looks good. There's the package of the lathe. Nice Mulan or whatever, plywood cover, metal corners, and all strapped down. So I'm going to put all this stuff in the hangar for now. So I've been working on getting the hangar cleaned out or straightened out to where I can get have enough room to put all that stuff. And I'll get it in there in a few minutes. Got a couple things I need to do yet in there before I fill it up with this junk. Got a Grizzly G4003G 12x36. It's in the crate here. I bought it last year. I tried to order it last year in November, and Grizzly screwed up the order. I wound up getting it in December. I don't know whether it came after the first of the year, I guess. Bought a whole bunch of stuff from them. A sander, some stuff for my wife for woodworking and stuff. Anyway, I didn't really have a place to put it at the time. I didn't want to take time to put it together. I didn't really want to put it in here in the hangar, so I left it in the crate, and I pushed it up close to the front door to the hangar as I could, which was the most out of the way spot we could find for it at the time, and it's sit there for about 10 months now. Oh, I need to move it because I need to open the hangar door here, the middle door, to get my pickup in here to do some work on it, and now it's in the way. It's in the crate still. I just opened the top of it up. I opened the plastic up last winter, and we put a peat air dryer in there, P-E-E-T, same company that makes peat shoe dryers. Kept that on it all winter, and I just opened it up here. I had stuff stacked on it, of course. That's what happens when you have a horizontal surface, things get stacked on it. But anyway, I just got everything cleaned off of it and opened it up, and it still looks good in there. So I'm going to go ahead and uncrate it now and see about maybe putting it together, putting it on the stands. Okay, I got it out of got the crate opened up. I still got it on the pallet, or the bottom that it's attached to for shipping, but I got the crate opened up. Now, most of it comes apart pretty good. The top and the sides have these little round pieces here, and they're pressed into the plywood. There's a corner piece that goes on here, an angle piece. It's again pressed into the plywood, and it's angled over the edge there, and it has slots in it. So these tabs here fit through those slots, and that's pretty much the way the old toys used to be when I was a kid. You'd put them together. Tab A goes into slot B, or tab A went into slot A, and tab B went into slot B. But anyway, that part come together. The top's held on that way, so once you get those straightened out, it just pulls off with a little bit of tugging, because these things of course are bent a little bit. The sides, they were the same way. They have them in the sides, but then they were nailed in on the bottom, and so it took a little bit of prying with a pry bar to get those out without ripping everything up. And I couldn't just use a regular crowbar, a wrecking bar, to get in there. I wound up getting a tire iron that was flat. They used this tire iron that was flattened on one end here so I could get in there and pry it, because regular crowbar had too much of a bend in it here, and it run into the machine when I was trying to pry it apart, get it open. Got the plastic off and all the odds and ends out of it, so the only thing left on that pallet is just the machine itself. Now it's bolted down there to the pallet, so it's going to take a little bit more to get it off than just pulling it off or picking it up. So we'll work on that a little bit. So far going over it, I haven't found any damage to it or anything like that. Everything looks pretty good. Now here's what was in the crate with the lathe. There's this box here that was strapped down or tucked in underneath one side on the back, and it says chucks on it. So I don't have any idea what's in there. I know what Chuck put in there. It comes with a 4-jaw chuck and a 3-jaw chuck. Here inside is the technical documents for the chuck, 4-jaw independent chuck, and these are a D1-5, so those are the pins for that. There's 6 pins in that, and a chuck key and some little screws. And there's the chuck there. And the 3-jaw chuck is mounted on the machine. This was in there as a faceplate. And then we have this little toolbox here. And when I first looked at it, I thought the toolbox, it's got a mark right here. I thought it had been dented somehow in there, even though it was strapped down. Now this toolbox is the only thing. It was strapped down with some steel strapping. Everything else is strapped down with fiber strapping. This looked like it had been abraded there. Maybe something fell on it, but I see what it is this handle was just laying there turned down like that when the paint was wet. And it's not a very good box or very good paint job, but it'll do. And inside of it, of course, is all the parts for it. Here was the instructions for the lathe that was inside this box. This is Morse Taper 3 B16 M12. There's some handles, a bottle of some kind. Oh, here's the center sleeve for the number 5 to the number 3 center. Yeah, Morse Taper 5 to number 3. So it has a Morse Taper number 5 in the headstock and a 3 in the tailstock. A bunch of wrenches, bolts, gears. Oh, that's for the cap for the bottle, must be for oil. There's a tool holder, a couple screwdrivers, Phillips head and a flat head, some kind of a bar. There's 3 bars in there. And then Morse Taper 3, Morse Taper 3 center, and another Morse Taper 3 center. And drill chuck. Oh, yeah, this one must be, oh, that's a live center. That's what it is. I thought that was a drill chuck, but that's a live center. Okay, now got to read the instructions and see what to do next. But I'll have to unbolt the lathe from the pallet. The lathe is pretty well lubed up and greased up and stuff to keep it from rusting. I'm sure everything Grizzly has and all these stuff that comes from China is coated in crappy grease. But in this country where we got humidity at 80-90% most of the time, everything gets rusty anyway. So I've built boxes for my tools to put heat lamps in them. My wife got this. It's a peat dryer, and that's what it's for. It's got a little heat coil in there, draws air in through here, heats it up and circulates it. I've used peat shoe dryers for years. In fact, I lived in St. Mary's, Idaho for a few years working on the railroad, and that's where Mr. Pete lived. Shipped out his stuff, was out of St. Mary's. I'm sure everything's made in China anymore, but it used to be made in St. Mary's, Idaho. So I'm doing a little investigating here, unpackaging and checking things out. Most of it looks pretty good. This is the packing list that came in the manual, and I just went through it to use it for a cheat sheet, checkoff sheet to make sure all the parts were there. Went through everything, and so far it all looks good. It's all there. These screws here I thought were extra jaws, brass tip jaws for the steady rest. Those are for the spider in the back of the headstock that supports long rods and stuff that go all the way through the headstock like rifle barrels. So everything looks like it's there. I took off the steady rest and the follower rest to just make the lathe lighter. I also took off the 3-jaw chuck, so make it so it's a little lighter picking it up. The only thing that I saw that had any damage to it was the backsplash, and that's got some wrinkles in it. It was packaged pretty well and had shipping a bubble wrap around it, but I think what happened is the strapping that they used on it got kind of tighter. So I'm going to go ahead and put the stand together. I'll have to move this stuff back out of the way to give me a little more room underneath my hoist. I've got some straps on the lathe ready to pick it up. There's the lathe stands over there, so I'll go ahead and get those put together. We've got angles there that screw into the sides of the stand on each of them, and then over there on the far left there's a little shield that goes between them that kind of holds them apart. Well, I did a little more than just put the stand together, I guess. Cleaning things up after I got the stand together, and I got help come down here, so I just went ahead and mounted the thing up and get it all slid over here out of the way now, where I can get the pickup in here to start working on it. Still going to take a lot of work to get this thing going. It's together, it's on the stand, but it's still got to be all cleaned up. I don't see any oil in the headstock. I do see oil in the carriage. Anyway, it's all got to be cleaned up. There's oil all over everything. We'll put everything away for now. Now it's going to be a while before I get back to this now to get it all cleaned up and stuff. I've got too many other things to do now to fool with it. Well, putting that stand together turned out a little more complicated than I expected. There's angle brackets that fit onto each one of those stands, and they're just screwed in with those number 10 screws. Putting those on turned out to be more of a challenge than I expected. The stands are threaded for them, so you can just put the screws in there, but the holes in the angle brackets were off. I wound up with a little use of a chainsaw file to get the holes lined up to where they would fit. And these M10 screws that go on that little shield there, that nameplate, they just seemed like they were too short. They just barely fit through, and you just barely get the nut on them. So I went up and dug in my parts bin, and I found some 1032 screws and some nylock nuts to put on there. I put the washers that they supplied on them. Now the only downside to that was that I had to go dig out a snap-on Torx head screwdriver to fit the number 10 screws instead of being able to use that fine Phillips head screwdriver that was supplied by Grizzly to put on their screws. Putting the lathe on, it was a little bit of a challenge. I had those big straps I showed earlier, so they kind of interfered with getting the bolts in the headstock and pinched on the tailstock. We got the tailstock bolts lined up and got those in first. Now, one thing I should have done before I did all of that is I should have taken the bolts and run them down through those cast holes in the lathe bed before I tried to put them on there. Probably should have threaded them into the stands first, although they went into the stands okay. But there's some heavy paint and body putty or whatever they use for filler on that to cover up all the casting, rough casting marks and stuff. Those holes were full of that crap, and so we had them lined up over the table and then push those bolts down through there. And you're supposed to put silicone sealer in around the holes on that chip tray, both underneath the chip tray where it mounts to the stands and on top of the chip tray where the lathe bed bolts down to it. Of course, when I went to put the bolts through in the tailstock end of it, all that crap came down, and so we lifted it up, cleaned it all off, and put it back down on there. But then it was just as bad, actually worse on the headstock end. There was a whole bunch of crap come out of there. So I should have cleaned those holes out first. We've got them all tightened down now, and it's all on. Get it cleaned up now and oiled up. But like I said, that's not going to be for a while.